The topic that we're studying today is faith and politics. If you have your binders, it's the yellow covered sheet. And I want to preface this morning by saying that my goal today, in some ways actually picking up on the conversation with Micha last night, is to both inhabit a Torah conversation on Jewish values and Jewish ethics, and at the same time try to bridge to some of the contemporary challenges with respect to how the world of politics operates and the intersection between faith and politics that is increasingly defining for both North American Jews as well as the Israeli Jewish community. And I'm going to try to do that in a explicitly nonpartisan way, which doesn't mean non-ideological. So we're going to have to sort this out. It's going to be interesting and tricky. Two public service announcements. One is Happy Canada Day. The second is, on a more somber note, I wanted to dedicate this morning's learning to the memory of the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, who passed away, I believe, last night or this morning. It's an appropriate dedication because although I never was a particular fan of the politics of Yitzhak Shamir, one of the things that made him unique and which makes him actually a throwback to a different day of politics was that as a very committed ideologue, he also lived out his values. And so he's a unique Israeli politician for whose wickedness has no scandal section. And it really is a real throwback of the Zionism of ideals and ideologies that actually translated into an ethical leadership, even if not a universally appreciated leadership. So how often in our political discourse, I focus primarily in North America, but it applies equally well here in Israel as well. How often in our political discourse do we hear ambivalence from our politicians? Right? So far removed is the culture of ambivalence that when a politician says something like, doesn't actually even acknowledge that they've shifted their positions, but in fact shifts their positions on the basis of circumstance, ideology, reality, or political expediency. Right? Making any of those shifts, we tend to respond by calling that politician a waffler, a wishy-washy, right? The culture of ambivalence is so far removed from the political discourse that it's hard to imagine the possibility that if somebody actually got up and said, look, I believed this 10 years ago because these were the realities, and now I don't believe that anymore because realities have changed, that we're highly skeptical of that view. But even worse, right, the more human view would be to say, look, this is what I believe would be a good political solution here. But I have no idea whether I'm going to be right. All I can give is my best guess effort, that the best thing that we could do right now is invade Iraq, right? The best thing we should do right now is create a platform for universal health care. And I don't know. It might be cost prohibitive. It ultimately might wind up destroying our political system. I don't really know. But based on the evidence that I have at my disposal, right, I think this is probably the way to go. Totally unelectable in the current political climate, right? We demand from our politicians implicitly a total clarity of conviction, not only about the ideology that underlies the politics that they're about to promote, but about the outcomes, right? Which is doubly devastating. We want both total clarity of conviction and we want certainty, almost prophecy, that a belief in these particular political actions in the present is going to yield the right political outcomes in the future. And what's remarkable is that I suspect that we as a political culture demand that from our politicians when we don't demand it from ourselves personally. Right? So perhaps that's because we kind of ambitiously want our politicians to embody something that's greater than us, which parenthetically is not borne out by the ethical lives of our politicians. Right? Our politicians are a mirror of us. But we want our politicians in some way to create a political culture that is rooted in certainty when we, in our own lives, operate well outside of the parameters of certainty. This is, I don't have a great historical view on this, right? I only know, my first time I voted was, I think, 1992. So I don't know whether Is that right? Maybe, no, it wasn't 1992, it was 1996. I don't know whether historically, yeah, okay. I don't know whether this is historically a new reality, but I sense that this is getting worse in our political culture. The demand for certainty, the demand for absolute conviction, even as news cycles make that absolute conviction even harder to attain. And what it's going together with, which is even more problematic, is the rise of public demonstration of faith as a vehicle of political candidacy. Right? That we seem to expect a very clear sensibility about the faith of our politicians, which I think is very hard to separate from this culture of conviction. Because what it's doing is both linking faith to conviction, right? And linking conviction to the political outcomes that we want. What it's making of faith in the process is faith has become a vehicle for certainty rather than a vehicle for ambivalence. Right? The faith that we want in our politicians is the faith in that links from core ideologically held beliefs to the certainty of the outcomes or the behaviors that should emerge as a result of those beliefs. The consequence of all of this is that we are seeing, I think, in political culture, a radical redefinition of faith, or a placing on a pedestal of a kind of faith that, at least for me personally, makes me uncomfortable. I don't know if it makes you all uncomfortable. We can debate that during our Q&A. But it makes me uncomfortable. Because even though, or perhaps especially because I spend a lot of my time around Jewish texts and Jewish learning, right? The last thing I feel, just as a Jew, is a certainty of faith, an absoluteness of the categories, and much less that my belief in certain things necessarily forces my hands in terms of my behaviors or my political convictions. I don't know. I like ambivalence. It's not that I like ambivalence because I don't like making decisions. It's not that I like ambivalence because I'm trying to hedge my bets on the possibility of one outcome or another outcome. I like ambivalence because I really don't know. And that seems to me, in some ways, to be a much more interesting approach to faith than faith linked to certainty. If you believe something to be true, right, if your beliefs are linked to absolute truths, I know this, I believe it to be 100% true, faith is totally uninteresting. Right? If I believe something, but I'm not really sure that it's true, then the idea of that makes actually a very interesting faith, because I'm holding on, right, in some deep conviction to the hope that something is correct, or to the hope of a particular outcome, but I can't really know given the data that's at my disposal. That seems to me a place at which faith can have a certain kind of vibrancy, and I think this is going to be a key issue, a certain kind of humility that, if applied to a political system, would radically change the overall culture. The Torah has a couple of examples of ambivalence. I'm looking for more. So far I got an incredible comment in the Genesis when Jacob is journeying from one place to another, falling asleep, right? And in his dream sees angels ascending and descending the ladder. And Jacob wakes up and he says, Jacob woke from his sleep and said, "Lo, there is God in this place, and I had no idea." Right? He then comes along, then his next comment is, "Lo and behold, this is the place of God and the gate of heaven." Now what's amazing is that the gate of heaven, anybody know congregation's name, Shar Shamayim? Right? The Shar Shamayim, the gate of heaven, becomes designated as the place where God is. But Jacob's instinctive moment when he wakes up is, holy cow, God was here and I had no idea. That is, his encounter with the reality that he faced gave him no indication that he was actually living in a place of God. Now, it's not the same as the total ambivalence that I was describing, but there's something exciting and suggestive about the possibility of discovering God in unknown places. Rather than him setting out and saying, "This is God's place, I know it to be certain," and being proven right, he wakes up and discovers, all I thought was that this was basically a pile of rocks. It turns out I was in a heavenly place. The more suggestive site at which the Torah deals with ambivalence is in the book of Esther. I know some of you have seen this in some of your sources so far, some of your classes. In the 4th chapter, and I think this verse is classically and historically misunderstood. In the 4th chapter of the book of Esther, Mordecai comes to Esther, and he says to her, right, in the kind of the climax of the story, if you stay silent at this moment, right, salvation and rescue will come to the Jews from another place, and you and your family will perish. Parenthetically, why? Why will you and your family perish? Because we'll kill you, right? Right? Let me unpack the whole thing. Then the next sentence, which is key, right, is Umi yodea in le'et kazot higat lamalchut. Who knows whether it was precisely for a moment like this that you reached the point of sovereignty? Now, classically, right, we understand this because we want to hear God in the book of Esther. We understand that when Mordecai says to Esther, who knows whether it was for exactly this moment, wink, wink, that you reached sovereignty, meaning it's exactly for this moment that you reach the place of, right? God is the puppet maker here. God has created the circumstances place at the right time. But what if we read it as genuinely a question mark? I don't know why you're here. This worked out in really unique and strange ways, but the result of that circumstance is that you have an opportunity to affect change given the circumstances that you're in. And if you decide not to do it, it's not that God will find some other solution and resolve it. It's that we'll find some other solution and resolve it. Remember, we have yet to cash. Mordecai, remember he caught those guys plotting against the king? He hasn't cashed in that chip yet. Right? If Mordecai, I'm just trying to find a solution. You're my best bet. I don't know why you're here, but you're my best bet. So let me use you. Now, what happens when we read that text as ambivalence rather than conviction? It totally changes the meaning of the verse. It's not that God is orchestrating the political realities of the book of Esther. It's that human beings are orchestrating the political realities in the book of Esther. And what would happen in our political culture if we said, it's not that I'm the president of the United States by divine right. I'm the president of the United States because of all sorts of unique conditions, and this is my best bet, my best guess for how it is that I want to lead this political culture. It's a radical shift of thinking about the relationship between faith, the holding of serious convictions, and the assumption that there's inevitable outcomes or behaviors or things that I'm supposed to do as the result of those outcomes. The intersection of faith and politics has two extremely dangerous extremes that I want to name today. The one that we know, I think, more explicitly and more obviously is the risk of fundamentalism. Right? If I have a political culture that's defined by faith, by such strongly held ideas and convictions that I believe them to be not just true for me, but true for everybody else, true in the universal and the uniform sense, then it forces my hand to behave in a certain way, and it forces me to force my view on other people. Right? Fundamentalism is at its core, right? The idea that the beliefs that I hold are so foundational and so universally true that they create inevitable behaviors on the other end. And the culture of political fundamentalism, guided by religion, is on the rise throughout the world, and our civilization, as Jews, is not immune. Right? One of the reasons, the religious fundamentalism is on the rise throughout the world, and our Jewish societies and our political societies are not immune from this risk. And I say this with some humility, right? The fact that there is a rise in religious fundamentalism in Israel, in a way for a Jewish fundamentalism that has never been experienced in 2,000 years, is only new now because Jews never had power before. But it is almost an inevitable outcome of a religious civilization holding power that it is going to breed a culture of fundamentalism. Because the way we instinctively understand faith is that it is, as I said before, is that it's so rooted in strong convictions that I necessarily believe that I'm going to force those behaviors on others. So that's one risk of the encounter with faith in politics. And I want to talk about that near the end. But I want to talk about a different risk first. And that is a little bit more of a subtle, but I think equally insidious risk, which is that the culture of faith in its encounter with politics trivializes faith to a profound degree. Let me step out onto thin ice. And some of you who read the Jewish Week article that I think was part of the pre-readings may have seen that I mentioned this, and I want to go into a little bit further. When then Senator Obama was running for president, right, there was the scandal of Jeremiah Wright, the pastor in his church, who was on record as having spoken in church in profoundly offensive anti-Semitic ways. Right? We all know what I'm talking about? Okay. The most plausible answer that now President Obama could have given to how it was that he sat in that church and countenanced all of these offensive things, the most accurate answer that he could have given was what? I was never really there, right? I'm not a churchgoer. It is a totally implausible answer in the American political system to say, I don't belong to a particular faith. Now, a lot of people were scandalized by the Jeremiah Wright episode, largely because they felt it reflected poorly on him as a person of faith, right? That as a person of faith, he should have resisted, he should have stood up, should have distanced himself from Jeremiah Wright. I was offended by the Jeremiah Wright scandal from the opposite reason. The idea that somebody has to pretend to be a person of faith in order to get elected to political office and can't even publicly acknowledge that they didn't go to church so dramatically trivializes faith or what it means to belong to a religious tradition. So that it becomes this kind of superficial frame of what it means to be a person of faith. For President Obama to never go to church but to publicly take on the persona of being a churchgoer trivializes what it means for the rest of us who go to shul quite regularly, right? That becomes the picture of faith in America is I have to pretend that I go and put myself in awkward positions relative to the things that are set up there. I was much less scandalized by the actual content of Jeremiah Wright's sermons because I've been to plenty of synagogues with equally offensive sermons, and the last thing I want to have happen is that the media and the public culture investigates the content of every sermon across the country, right? I think it'll be equally bad for the Jews. So I don't care about the content, but I'm embarrassed by a political culture in which the politicians have to pretend to be people of faith, and the consequence of which is a total lack of sincerity in terms of what we talk about with faith. So what I want to do today, let me give you another example actually also from here in Israel. A number of years ago, at my parents' house, we had dinner with a Chaver Knesset from the now defunct Shinui party. There was a brief moment in Israeli politics when there was such anger against the religious establishment that a party that single platform issue was the separation of religion and state was able to accumulate, I believe it was 10 seats, maybe even higher than that. I think maybe actually 17 seats in its heyday. And it went from 17 seats 10 years ago to 0 today. And at the time, we had dinner, a Shabbat dinner, with this pronounced lefty Chaver Knesset who had this vicious and vitriolic public face with respect to religion. Vicious. At the end of dinner, we were going to do Birkat HaMazon because my parents' house is observant, even though they served in a political role. And this Chaver Knesset, this member of Knesset, jumped up and volunteered to lead the Birkat HaMazon. And he launched into this incredible Rabotai Nevarech, and then sang the entire Birkat HaMazon for the next 10 minutes. And the whole room was basically dumbfounded. I mean, literally just sat silently and watching this guy perform the entire Birkat HaMazon fluidly and from memory. And afterwards, there was then the kind of a pregnant pause. And I think it was my dad or somebody else said, what is that? What's that about? And he said, I love Birkat HaMazon. I come from a religious family. I love all of this stuff. I just don't want it to be part of the political culture. Now that's a completely reasonable, or put differently, I don't want it to be required on anybody else. I don't want it to be coercive. Now that's a perfectly reasonable political outcome. But again, what is scandalous about it is that nuance was never part of his public persona, right? To stand up and actually be religious in the public and to model, Birkat HaMazon is a beautiful thing. I just don't think everybody should be obligated to do it, is a kind of nuanced bridging between faith and its place in the public square. And for him as a politician, it was so difficult to construct that nuance that the instinct was to construct a combative public identity. Both of these examples, this example in Shinui and the Obama example, to me are symptomatic of the same problem. That in order to make faith work in a political culture, we almost necessarily trivialize it, right, by making such concrete distinctions as opposed to nuance. What I want to try to promote, and in some ways today I'm not just showing you text, but I'm actually making a case for something. What I want to try to make a case for today is how we might think of a legitimate and authentic reading of faith within Jewish tradition, which embodies two characteristics that are in some ways opposite to each other, that might help us to operate better, or to think about the role of faith better when it encounters politics and when it encounters the public sphere. And those two goals are, on one hand, humility, that faith entails not, the opposite of fundamentalism is humility. The instinct of fundamentalism, which is to see a direct link between the things I believe, the actions I undertake in the world, and as a result, the outcomes that come out on the other end. The opposite is the humility of, I don't know what I actually believe, I don't know what I actually could do, and I have no idea what it's going to produce at the other end. Right? Humility becomes the polar opposite to fundamentalism. And the flip side, so that humility doesn't become totally banal, because if you really believe, if you have total humility, you might actually become paralyzed from acting in the world. If you really don't believe that you have any idea what the direct outcome of the things that you do is, you might just say, I better not touch anything because I might ruin it. Right? The reverse of that is sincerity. The two primary ideas here that I want to lay on the table is how do you balance, or how do you create an attitude towards faith that is legitimate and authentic coming out of the Jewish tradition, and that encounters the world of the political in a way that embodies both humility and sincerity, that actually accomplishes something, that makes something real, that does something, because I'm not making a case here for a radical delinking of faith and politics. I think it's unrealistic to the full human self. I think these are powerful human instincts. I think they belong together, and yet I think they dramatically need to be nuanced. And so perhaps some combination of humility and sincerity help us to imagine a political reality that is less dangerous in terms of the trivialization of religion or the fundamentalization of religion. Before I go on, any just clarification questions and comments before we look at some texts? Okay. To name this divide through a couple of contemporary political writers, I want you to look at the first two sources, which help to really, I think, spell out the distinction that I'm trying to draw. And they're from Leo Strauss and Hilary Putnam, right? Balancing things in a lot of different ways. The Strauss reading, I want you to look at page 3. And we're just looking at that, the embedded paragraph at the bottom of page 3. Strauss writes as follows: philosophy as such is nothing but genuine awareness of the problems, of the fundamental and comprehensive problems. It is impossible to think about these problems without becoming inclined towards a solution, towards one or the other of the very few typical solutions. Yet as long as there is no wisdom but only quest for wisdom, the evidence of all solutions is necessarily smaller than the evidence of the problems. Therefore, the philosopher ceases to be a philosopher at the moment at which the subjective certainty of a solution becomes stronger than his awareness of the problematic character of that solution. We'll unpack this. At that moment, the sectarian is born. Strauss is naming one extreme of the problem, which is essentially the Obama problem. It's not so much the fundamentalist problem. Philosophy, the search for wisdom, or we might take it differently and talk less about wisdom and talk about faith, is about the big questions towards which are, and we know this to be true on a human level, the big questions that we ask, this is true with any class you ever take, the big questions that you ask, and it's going to be true with this class too, are always going to be better than the solutions that you provide. Because the solutions are the mechanism by which I'm able to live in the world, make practical decisions as a result of a big problem that is difficult for me to handle. Right? The philosophy, right, and the search for wisdom, knowledge, or faith is nothing but genuine awareness of the problems. But the instinct to solve them, which is necessary for living in the world, makes you choose answers that are necessarily inferior to the bigness of the problems. Right? And the minute that that happens, and Strauss, I think, is right here, the minute that that happens, sectarianism is born. Because the minute I take a really big challenge and force myself into a small box relative to that problem, I've taken something infinite and I've boxed it into something small. This is where the trivialization of religion when it encounters politics happens. Right? I believe in big ideas. I believe in lofty notions of faith. I believe in big values, but ultimately I translate those values into very specific and concrete political outcomes. A politician says, on one hand, I believe in the kingdom of heaven on earth, and that inclines me to believe that school children should be given vouchers in areas with bad public schools. Right? Think about the trivialization of Jesus' idea of the kingdom of heaven on earth when it gets translated into a particular political outcome. Right? This is what Strauss is naming as the problem of philosophy. The problem of philosophy is that we know that these questions are much bigger than the particular solutions that we might provide. We have to provide particular solutions when philosophy encounters politics, and the result of that is a necessary inferiority. Now, you might step away from Strauss's reading and say, let philosophers not become politicians, right? We know that would be equally devastating. We don't want to say that because philosophy or because faith, right, necessarily becomes reduced to smaller things, that smart, faithful, philosophical people should not enter into politics. That would be much worse. If politics was only the realm of the pragmatists, I think it would be much worse. We want philosophy, we want faith, and we want wisdom to enter into our political system. But we're fearful. So he's naming one of the big issues here. We're fearful that the minute it does so, it necessarily produces a sectarianism. Right? It becomes a smaller, trivial, compared to the big vision that the faith itself or philosophy is trying to promote. The flip side to this issue, and I want you to turn to the last page here, page 6 of this essay by Hilary Putnam on Must We Choose. And I'm just going to tell you what book this is drawn from. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum wrote an essay about 20 years ago, about 15, 20 years ago, on asking the question of what is greater? What's a greater value? Cosmopolitanism, right? The belief in universalism, or patriotism, my loyalty to a particular people or a particular place. I want to map that question onto our topic for today. What's greater? What's a greater value? Universalism, right? The belief that all civilizations and all faiths are ultimately morally equal, or the loyalty to my own particular faith. Right? That's how it becomes relevant for our subject today. To her great credit, Martha Nussbaum writes this 15, 20-page essay in defense of cosmopolitanism against patriotism. And to her great credit, she then invites 15 philosophers to argue back. And then she published all of it. It was a great exercise in intellectual pluralism. Right? I'm not just arguing my case, I'm going to argue my case, get some responses, and that's what you study. So if you're looking for a reading list for after the seminar, I would recommend buying the $15 book For Love of Country by Martha Nussbaum with a list of another 12, 15 authors. In his response to Martha Nussbaum, Hilary Putnam, well, let me see where I want to pull it out from here. Let's just read the last paragraph here. I am no relativist. We're on page 10. Page 10. Sorry. The essay starts on page 6. We're at the end on page 10. I am no relativist, he says. And he's making a defense of loyalty to a particular faith. Like Martha Nussbaum, I believe that there is such a thing as reasoning well about moral issues. But, I repeat, actual reasoning is necessarily always situated within one or another historical tradition. This is going to be key to this idea and key to this issue, right? I can believe in moral reasoning across the platforms, but what I can always argue for more effectively is from something that comes out of a particular moral tradition. Right? Leo Strauss, in a different essay, writes, what is a Baal Tshuva? What is a person who is a repentant? What does that mean? It's the Jew who claims, till they're red in the face, that they want to participate in a universal culture, and realize when they finally get admitted to the club of universalism that they're the only member, and decides to retreat back into their particular faith tradition. Right? He's hinting a little bit at this. Right? The notion that there's only such a thing as situated intelligence. When coming out of the best I can do in order to even be a universalist, to be a cosmopolitan, is to actually belong to a particular faith tradition. Right? You see, if I prioritize my one faith tradition over something else, I open up the risk of fundamentalism. Right? That's part of the problem that's hinted here. If Strauss is on one end, Putnam is on the other end. And we're stuck between these two dramatic risks. One risk that by loyalty to my own particular faith tradition, I'm going to prioritize it over others, and as a result, I'm going to force others to do as I expect them to do. And the flip side is, I don't want to trivialize faith, right, by making it merely the shell or the coating on any particular ideology. Here's, I think, the basic philosophical problem, and I want to try to see whether, from a couple of classical Jewish sources on humility and a couple of classic Jewish sources on sincerity, we can try to mount a different challenge, a different approach to faith that enables us to live in between these two challenges. Again, any other questions or comments? Yes, Eric.
Are you using faith and religion as synonymous or different?
I guess I'm using them a little bit more synonymously, but I guess I'm using faith as one of the exercises of belonging to a particular religious tradition, right? So if we eliminated faith out of religion, then it's merely a kind of cultural coding. These are my behaviors, these are your behaviors, but we share the ultimate truths. Why faith has to be an essential feature of this conversation is because faith is the belief in ultimate truths at the exclusion of others, right? So if the extent to which if you take faith out, then we don't really care about anything, right? Then we're just talking about different cultural behaviors. I think faith has to be an essential component of this in order for it to be a real question. Yes?
So then does universalism actually trivialize faith?
According to this argument, yes. According to the Putnam argument, yes, right? He says at the end, we all have to live and judge from within our own particular inheritances while remaining open to insights and criticism from the outside. And that is why the best kind of patriotism, loyalty to what is best in the traditions one has inherited, is indispensable, right? I need to have this kind of loyalty to my own thing in order to be able to be open to the possibility of others. Right? This counter-argument is that I think this is a key question. The trend towards universalism trivializes faith too, because it says all we are is a shared set of beliefs, which eliminates the possibility of really strong convictions. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, Jackie.
I guess if you stay true to your own principles and your own beliefs, wherever that happens to fall, you can't hear me? If you stay true to your own principles and your own beliefs, then wherever that happens to fall, that's where you are, whether that's fundamental or whether that's universal or whether that's a tradition. I mean, I want to make sure I understand this, that what is the guiding principle for a person?
Right, so I guess what I'm trying to unpack, hopefully with some success, is that the instinct of being true to one's belief, right, and true to one's faith almost necessarily inclines you to believe that you believe in that as opposed to anything else, or to the exclusion of anything else. And that's okay if all you are is a citizen of the world. But if you are a political leader, does that require that you impose your beliefs and views on others? That's the fundamentalist instinct. That since I believe this to be true, over everything else. And I think Putnam's argument is you have to have loyalty to your own tradition first. In order to be a citizen of the world, a better citizen of the world, you have to have loyalty to your own tradition first, which means it's okay to have your indispensable beliefs that you are right in the theological sense and other people are wrong. But the minute that that becomes applied to political leadership, does that necessarily lead you down a path to fundamentalism? Yeah, Wes.
I don't quite get why these risks. I don't quite get why these risks of fundamentalism and universalism are essential. Why can't I say it's totally true for me? Totally true for me. It's worth living for. It's worth transmitting to my kids. I believe in it passionately with every fiber of my being. For me. So why does believing in my truth principle, my patriotism, my religion, my conservative Judaism, I believe in it with every fiber of my being, my conservative Judaism, totally true for me, but I don't have any need to impose it on anybody else. So why is it that by believing so strongly for me in my truth principle that I somehow am at risk of being a zealot and trying to impose it? It doesn't seem like it's an inevitable risk.
Okay, so first of all, I've never heard a politician say that. Right? I'm a true believer in X, Y, and Z, but that's only what happens in the context of my own heart. I guess the closest it came to it was Jimmy Carter's Playboy interview, right? Right, the closest is that, right, which is, this is within my own heart, but it doesn't guide the principles by which I govern, right? I've never heard a politician say that. Instead, you actually hear politicians say, I'm going to pray to my tradition. Right? This was Bush 43, right? I'm going to pray to find out the right outcome, which is I'm going to search my soul and my tradition to figure out how properly to govern. So what you're describing is a totally viable stance for a citizen of the world to take. I believe in total conviction about this. I'm going to use it as the principles to guide and govern my life, and possibly to find the other people and the other communities who share these beliefs and share that. And we can create a whole multicultural society of people with strongly held beliefs. I think that's a great stance, and it's fabulously important. Now, take that view and try to map it politically. And you have two possible risks. One is that because of the instinct to believe that what I believe is totally true and right, that I have to impose it on others. The other risk, the Obama risk, is that I'm going to draw a clean separation between me as a person of faith and me as a person of politics, and so politics winds up not having any of the benefits of faith, right? It loses the ability for faith, with all of its great benefits, its great teachings, its great Torah, to actually positively affect politics. So you actually want them to bleed between the two. You just don't want it to bleed to the point where it forces fundamentalism or it forces trivialization. Yes?
So where would you put Ted Kennedy, who was a very religious person, I think, or at least the family was, and yet some of his decisions and his politics were really against what the church believed?
I don't know how to answer this. Look, Ted Kennedy is, in some ways, a classic pre this decade American Jewish politician. Because Ted Kennedy does exactly this separation between, American Jews have classically not voted their religion. They've classically not voted their place within the political system. And so he kind of embodies a little bit of that cognitive dissonance. Let's hold on to it. We'll come back to it. Any other just conceptual questions before we review the status of our politicians? Yeah.
This might be a little
Yeah.
trite, but there are cases in which I'm not sure the tension exists. For example, human rights. John Kennedy's inaugural address said that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. Beautiful description. I don't know whether a left-wing politician would invoke God that way today, but that's really was the pregnant philosophy for 200 years in the country. It's hard for me to see
Yeah.
assuming that human rights is God-granted.
Right. So,
Within the
yeah.
context of America, I don't see, at least in that very big issue, I don't see the tension.
Let me answer that or address it by moving on. And I'll tell you why I want to move on. Because what you're naming forward, and the first question I think we have to wrestle with is if the act of faith is worshiping God and embodying God's values in the world, the first question we have to ask that helps us move out of the instinct that our political instinct is going to be to force our will on others is to ask the question of what God we're worshiping. Right? That's the first key question. It goes exactly to your issue. When a politician invokes God in order to justify or validate their actions, right, whether on things we like or things we don't like, what they're basically telling you is, I don't just worship God, I worship a particular God who shares my political convictions. And so I'm going to draw on the authority of that God in order to guide my hand and guide my actions. And the instinct towards fundamentalism, this is a critical point, the instinct towards fundamentalism is born out of the belief that faith in God is faith in certainty, or is faith in confidence. That when I worship, when I channel God, when I marshal God, I'm using an image of God that actually forces certain behaviors on other people. Right? God as conqueror, God as certainty. I want to first look at two rabbinic sources that actually portray a totally different vision of God. God as broken, God as humble, and God as not knowing. And part of the reason I want to do that is to get to your question, is to say, if I talk about myself as a person who is a person of legitimate faith who worships this God, it totally changes what I think my political instincts are in the world. That I'm not worshiping the conquering God. I'm not worshiping a God who's forcing God's will on others. I'm worshiping a God who helps me to embody something totally different in my persona. So let's look at two Talmudic texts. You want to play it back?
It's born out of faith and certainty.
Is born out of a faith and certainty, right? Because it imagines that the God that I'm worshiping is telling me to do one very specific thing, right? The model of the prophet or the revelation that tells me, you go do this exact thing. And what happens if the God that we're worshiping is actually portraying a different attitude? What happens if the God that we're worshiping is broken? Then does imitating God enable me to embody faith in a political way that is very different from the God of certainty? Let's look at these two amazing Gemarot. One is on page 12. And the rabbis are citing from Jeremiah, the great prophet of the destruction of the temple. And in citing from Jeremiah, they describe a verse that seems to suggest that God weeps. Right? God as weeping over the destruction. Now remember, the classic image of God is God as conqueror or rescuer of Israel. In this image, God is not portrayed as the rescuer of Israel, but God mourning over the fact that Jerusalem has been destroyed. Play this out theologically. What it means is, could God not prevent the destruction of Jerusalem? Of course God could. Page 12, on the top of the page. Could God not prevent the destruction of Jerusalem? Of course God could prevent it. Right? I could worship the God who is the conqueror. I could worship the God who is the destroyer. Here, I'm worshiping the God who is crying. What is the implication theologically of that? And let's read through it together. And citing from the verse, if you will not hear it, my soul shall weep in secret for the pride. And the rabbis have to ask the question, what does it mean for God to weep? What does it mean for God to cry? So the first answer by the literalist, who can't deal with the idea that God would actually be weeping, right, is Rabbi Shmuel ben Inya, who says in the name of Rav, the Holy One, blessed be He, has a place, and its name is secret. It's kind of a silly answer, right? He's not really taking up the challenge of understanding what it means for God to weep in secret. Instead, he's saying God weeps, but it's only in a special place called secret. It's silly. It's trivial. What is the meaning of the expression for the pride? Right? Let's skip down to where it says, but is there any weeping in the presence of the Holy One, blessed be He? Meaning, does God actually cry? The rabbis ask now the core question, does God actually cry? For behold, Rabbi Papa said, there is no grief in the presence of the Holy One. For it is said, honor and majesty are before Him, strength and beauty are His sanctuary. The counter-argument is, how can you imagine that God cries when God is described as being honorable, majestic, strong, and beautiful? Do you hear the theological debate taking place here between the rabbis? Which God are you worshiping? I want God to be honorable, majestic, big, and lofty, and that humans are broken in comparison to God. God is all of these majestic things, and think about what it means to worship that God. If the God that you worship is honorable, majestic, and strong, right, then you, as a person who imitates that God, have to be honorable, majestic, and strong. And so to be a believer is to be a true believer, is to be an adherent, is to be a soldier in the army of God. And I say that very specifically because that's the fundamentalist language that wound up both having destructive impulse on the Jewish people and for the Jewish people. The idea that people would take as a crusade to replicate, to imitate the God who is honorable, majestic, beautiful, and strong. The counter-argument is no, there is no contradiction. One case refers to the inner chambers, the other case refers to the outer chambers. Anybody want to unpack what you think that means? Yes? That's right. God has to have a public persona of being majestic, strong, honorable, and beautiful, but God has an inner persona of weeping. Extraordinary rabbinic idea, right? It's hard to reconcile these two images, right? The image of God as honorable, God as majestic, God as strong, and God as beautiful, contrary to the image of God as weeping in sorrow over the destruction of the Jewish people, as though powerless to actually do anything about it, as though aware that there are circumstances and events that take place in the world over which God doesn't have full control. So one answer that the rabbis try to give is, yes, God has bravado, but that's only the outer face of God. That's only the one that you see. You really want to understand God in the inner chambers, in the moment of intimacy, God is as broken, right, as humans. And so what does it mean to imitate God? It might mean to have both of these characteristics as a feature of a person of faith. That a person of faith has to embody both the outer majesty, right? Because you're a person of faith. You're created B'Tselem Elohim. You're created in the image of God. You do have to embody God. But does that mean that you close off the possibility that you are sometimes wrong, you are sometimes powerless, and you are sometimes broken? Not only does it not close it off, but a full articulation of those characteristics is how you actually imitate God more fully. Don, you had your hand up.
Isn't this the rabbis almost finding God in the image of man?
Sure.
It's entirely humanistic view. On some level, it's not that different from, well, we have discussion with someone like Shalom.
Yeah, I think I can live with that. I think I'm perfect. This is part of the reason I love the rabbis, is because they baldly take hold of a tradition that can't work in their world, and they remake it as a tradition that can work in their world, that attempts to be authentic to the tradition that they've inherited. It's the most empowered moment of Jewish intellectual creativity, to say, I need a theological system that actually helps me answer the questions that I'm dealing with today, but I don't want to do it simply on the basis of my own intellectual creativity. So I'm going to tie the needs of the day to the text that I've inherited. And the result is, as you're right, they have the God they want to worship is a God that they can understand humanly. But listen to that. What it means is that we can say, rather confidently, if we don't like how faith is being portrayed in the world, we need to change the object of that faith. Right? Because faith is basically, that's God and I worship it. Now, lo and behold, I look around and the worshipers, the people of faith, embarrass us. So either I could just change all of my actions, but the more powerful technique is to change God. And that's in some sense what the rabbis do here. By humanizing God, they set up a better model for us to worship. a better model for us to emulate, a God of humility rather than merely a God of bravado. Yes?
I would just like to offer an alternative or
Yeah.
a nuanced interpretation of brokenness or the weeping. I'd like to challenge that word brokenness. Perhaps what we can see here is a God who is informed by sadness and authenticity of feeling.
Are they at odds with each other?
I would argue, well, to me, brokenness and vulnerability connotes a kind of weakness, something that has to be hidden. But instead, for me, a person who is, or a God, that is aware of the reality of strong feelings can be a more compassionate God.
Okay, I'm willing to accept the modification, although I'm not sure at the end of the day. Yeah, I'm not sure at the end of the day that I really disagree with what you're trying to get me to say, which is to say that I think brokenness is a very lofty state. I don't think it's an inferior state. But so then we wind up coming close to the same place. Yeah, Ray.
Just as a proof text of the comment about the crying is that we know from our text that God is a God of justice and God is a God of mercy. And in order to have mercy, one has to have the ability to internalize and to cry.
Great. Now I want to look at a second version of this text. That's exactly right. How quickly do we move to understand, to emulating the God of justice at the cost of emulating the God of mercy, right? Let's look at the second version of this, which is on page 15, the Gemara Brachot. Just an unbelievable and wacky Gemara, one that I personally come back to a lot. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yossi, how do we know that the Holy Blessed One says prayers? Right? It's a totally bizarre place to start a question, right? What are they doing? I want the God that I worship to be a God who prays. Not interested. Not interested in that question. I want the God who I worship to be a God who prays. Right? Answer your own question. Right? The instinct is to believe. When you ask the question of who does God pray to, your instinct in understanding prayer, I'm going to put words in your mouth, is that prayer is a direct phone line to somebody else who's on the other end answering your question. The most perverse version of this, I mentioned this in my class yesterday, is the free throw theory of theology. That God is deeply invested in helping basketball players make their free throws. Right? That the Tim Tebowization of religion in America, right? That is in some sense the natural extension of that question. Prayer is a mechanism by which I ask questions that are specific to me, and there's somebody on the other end who's answering it. But what's a different theory of what it means to be a praying human being? Right? What's a different theory? Yeah, Marcy.
But it's a way for me to really look inside myself.
It's a form of constriction, of limitation. The irony of the Tebow phenomenon is that it is faux humility in the service of actually being very lofty. Right? It's faux humility in the interest of being very lofty, because I only bow down and kneel, I only thank God when I've actually scored a touchdown, when I've actually made the free throw, when I've actually holding the trophy. Right? The first person who gets thanked is God. Right? Do I thank God when I lose? Right? Do I thank God when I miss the free throws? Right? So prayer, there's a different theory of prayer that's operating here. And the prayer that's operating here is this has much more to do with me, the individual, than it does with the directness of the outcome on the other end. The God they want to worship in this text is a God who also prays. So that the act of prayer is an act of humility, of constriction, of lowering, rather than a God of the lofty. So how do we know that the Holy Blessed One says prayers? Because it says, right, it's in the Torah. I'll bring them, that we know this from the Yom Kippur liturgy, I'll bring them to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. In my house of prayer. Now what that means is it's my house in which they pray, but they're playing with it, right? This is a trick. What does it mean? What is my house of prayer? Hence you learn that the Holy Blessed One says prayers. Okay. Buy it, don't buy it. Don't like the reading, don't like the reading. It doesn't matter. The point is the theology and the reading of the text is instrumental to try to bring about this theological statement. So, but what's the obvious next question? This goes to Jackie's point. What would God possibly say? What would be the prayers that God would say, even to imagine the theology that I want to get to? Let me finish the text and then I'll come to your question. What does he pray? Rabbi Zutra, son of Tovi, said in the name of Rav, and this is the prayer: May it be my will that my mercy may suppress my anger, that my mercy prevail over all of my other attributes, so that I may deal with my children in the attribute of mercy, and on their behalf stop short of the limit of strict justice. An incredible prayer. God prays for God's mercy to defeat God's justice. Right, this goes to Ray's comment before. If I have these two, if God constantly is struggling with these two options, the option of being just, which entails stricture, of total obedience and fidelity, that if you don't do something right, you get punished. And if your vision for the world is this, then you constantly have to pursue it. And mercy is patience. It's actually ambivalence. It's, I know maybe you acted wrong, but it's incumbent upon me to hold back from punishing you for that action. Right? Mercy is what saves human beings. And what God prays is, let my merciful instinct be stronger than my just instinct. What God asks for, right, and the corollary is, what humans need to pursue if they're going to imitate God and pray to that God is this. Prayer is not the request for the envisionment of a just world. Prayer is the mechanism by which we try to put restraints on ourselves, in which we try to seek mercy to actually limit ourselves, in which we try to pursue beyond the direct fundamentalist instincts that faith would incline us to do, and instead suppress them under the act of mercy. Yes, Susan?
So I was going to add that Israel was in God's fulfillment when Moshe was in the top of the rock. Moshe saw the cleft, and the cleft he saw the good, the back of God's head during his fulfillment. It's a very corporeal image of God, but just what is God trying to pray for my people?
That's right. I thought about bringing this text too, and it's the continuation of this, because it's the natural continuation, right? Wearing a tefillin, again, is not merely a means of subordinating oneself to a God who is then, by making God into that human image, it makes us also constrict ourselves in a powerful way. There was another question on this side? All right, so this is the God that the rabbis want to worship, and so much so that they even go one step further. It's an incredible text that comes next. It was taught. Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha says, once, right, Yishmael ben Elisha was a high priest, so he actually had access to the Holy of Holies. And in this holy, if you had a chance, right, to actually encounter God, what would you say to God? I think this is a country song, actually. If you had an opportunity to encounter God, what would you say? In the innermost Holy of Holies. So it was taught. Rabbi Ishmael said, I once entered into the innermost part of the sanctuary to offer incense, and I saw Akatriel Yah Akatriel, in other words, in two names of God, the Lord of hosts, seated upon a high and exalted throne. And he said to me, Ishmael, my son, bless me. I replied, may it be your will, so it's the same blessing, that your mercy may suppress your anger, and your mercy prevail over your other attributes, so that you may deal with your children according to the attribute of mercy, and may on their behalf stop short of the limit of strict justice. Given the opportunity, right, I give you 3 wishes, right? The 3 wishes that Rabbi Ishmael says is, may your mercy override your strict justice. May you treat us mercifully. This is a penitential prayer that doesn't say, God, carry out the vision that you promised to lead in the world. Make your presence known. This is, in fact, God first acting humbly, and then Rabbi Yishmael modeling the same exact humility in the request that he's making of God. Right? You would expect that the last prayer would be for more wishes. Right? That should be the last one. Better access. But what is instead, right? And instead, this isn't bless me by telling me how lofty I am or how exalted I am. Bless me by telling me the power that you have to act humbly and justly towards your people. And he nodded to me with his head. God agrees that this is a legitimate prayer. And what halakha do the rabbis learn out of this? Here we learn incidentally that a blessing of an ordinary person must not be considered lightly before your eyes. Right? If God is willing to listen to the prayer of one of the rabbis, right, or the blessing of one of the rabbis, you too, human beings, should stop with your hierarchical politics in how you interact with one another. If God is willing to hear the blessing of a human being in the chamber of the Holy of Holies, you too, human beings, should stop taking so lightly the blessings of others. Right, so this becomes an anchor for a totally different portrayal of what it is to be an obeyer or an adherent to God. These two texts taken together model an approach to a sincere humility, which the rabbis are placing on a pedestal as what it means to be a person of true faith. And in a divine encounter, right, contrary to Moses, who in the encounter with God comes along and says, "Show me your glory," Yishmael ben Elisha comes across God, finds God inside the Holy of Holies, and is told, "I want you to bless me." The human opportunity that the rabbis are playing up here is that you actually have tremendous creativity in the present to be a blesser of God. Not just an embodier of God, not just a representative of God, but a blesser of God. And that blessing is a blessing that promotes mercy rather than justice. So one image taken together from these two sources, and there are more, I think your example before of God laying tefillin goes to the same issue as well. These taken together promote on one side here, right, that an adherent to God, a believer in God, is a believer in humility and a believer in mercy. Right? It is hard to be a fundamentalist after reading this text. Right. Yes, Eric.
But there were really two reasons why mercy could be used to temper justice. One is the one you're articulating, which is I, as the justice maker, have certain humility about the correctness of my social justice, and therefore I'm going to temper it. But the other is really a reflection on the people that you're imposing the justice upon. It could be a view, not that my justice is perhaps not correct. It is correct. But the people aren't good enough, aren't perfect enough for me to impose this high standard. And that's not really, by using the word mercy, it allows both of those possibilities. The second one is really not an issue of humility. It's really a declaration of the inadequacy of man. In other words, instead of
But isn't that another case for humility? Isn't human inadequacy another case for humility?
but not of the justice maker, not of the person who's imposing the law. It's not a question of his humility.
I actually do think it is God's humility that enacts God's mercy because of human failure. That's the lesson that happens after the flood, when God says, "I regret that I created humankind in this way because they're incapable of living up to the expectations that I hope that they would have, and therefore I'm not going to destroy them anymore." Which, in other words, God is actually taking accountability and responsibility that God is an imperfect creator. So that human failure is another vehicle that leads towards the possibility of God's humility. But, okay, hold on to it. Other questions? Yes?
You said it's hard to be a fundamentalist when you read these texts. Or fundamentalists read these texts. Or they study these texts. But what happens if they don't learn from these texts and stay fundamentalist?
No.
Ultimately, you must make a personal choice to accept these texts or not. And what is it that you can make a choice for not to be a fundamentalist, but to stay a fundamentalist? Or don't they read these texts in the spiritual orthodoxy?
Well, so look, so I grew up in an Orthodox household, and one of the features of my Orthodox education was that the worst sin you could possibly commit, worse than the cardinal sins of idolatry and incest and murder, was picking and choosing. Right? That was the worst thing. Nobody should pick and choose. I'm getting some nods. Because picking and choosing connotes, in an Orthodox framework, that you are not subordinating yourself to the worldview, but that you're actually choosing the things that you want to choose. The reality is, right, anthropologically and empirically, that everybody chooses, right? Everybody picks and chooses the sources, the texts, and the traditions that they think are useful and instrumental to the ideology of Judaism they want to promote. And I, right here, am no different. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, I can make a very credible argument very quickly on the legitimacy of a fundamentalist reading of Scripture, because it's all there, right? Kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven, pursue justice, kill the infidel, right? That stuff, that's a big part of the inheritance of religious tradition, is the instinct towards the fundamentalist move. What we have to do, and here's where I shift from teacher to activist, what we have to do is promote the sources from within our tradition that model something else and demonstrate the extent to which they represent an equally legitimate reading of Jewish tradition. Because if you want to make a counter-argument, you could either say the Torah, the Talmud, and all of this Jewish tradition naturally inclines you towards fundamentalism, or you look for the authentic sources within your tradition that help you model something different. My colleague, Rabbi Mishael Zion, the example he uses is, who some of you may have studied with here previously at the Institute, or now he lives in the States. The way he talks about this is, what are the characteristic mitzvot of Judaism? Right? If you study the Bible, what are the characteristic mitzvot of Judaism? And the natural answer is Shabbat and Kashrut. Right? Those are the defining mitzvot of Judaism. And what he likes to argue is, what mitzvah is taught more than any other mitzvah in the Torah? To care for the widow and the orphan. So there's been a kind of passive selection process that says that the defining mitzvot of Judaism are keeping Shabbat and keeping kosher. But I can make an equally credible, equally selective argument that the most significant mitzvah in the Torah is an ethic of social justice. It's just a matter of saying, I'm going to stand on a podium and make the claim for this being a legitimate reading of Jewish tradition, and then to translate it into the outcomes that I hope it produces. So would I like other Jews and other Jewish traditions to actually study humility, pluralism, and whatever else as legitimate expressions of Jewish values, and to use that as a mechanism for political action? Absolutely. And that's why I'm teaching it. Yes, Sissy.
Wouldn't we rather have a political figure who has faith, has a religion, or practices a religion, and anticipate that he or his speechwriter or advisor would go into that particular religion and others and find commonality of religious thinking that they could offer to their people, and that the people would then feel more comfortable with the fact of this thoughtfulness and the similarities that he would provide.
Amen. Right? But instead what happens is in the political culture is the reverse, which is that politicians use the religion as an articulation of their already strongly held partisan political attitudes.
But that could
Right.
be the exception rather than the rule. I mean, you're talking about one politician who may not be quite so smart about their strategy.
Well, I think I'm not inaccurately describing the mainstream political culture and the way that religion is used. Right? I don't see a widespread proliferation of politicians who use religion as a vehicle for sourcing humility, or who use religion as a vehicle for sourcing the common values that they're trying to promote and share with other politicians across the political spectrum. Instead, religion tends to be used as a blunt weapon, right, to actually authenticate strongly held partisan views that my opponent doesn't hold. So I become the values candidate as opposed to the one who implicitly has no values.
All right,
I think we share the outcome that we're
Right.
hoping for.
Right.
We totally share the outcome. I just think in order for that to happen, we got to create a source from within our own religious tradition that says that this is an authentic voice from within the tradition to talk about humility and the searching for mercy as an expression of Jewish ideal religious values.
I want to go back to something that you said that has to do with ambivalence.
Mm-hmm.
And this is for the Americans in our midst. When we heard from our Congress and from the candidates as well as our own president that nothing will get done until after the election, I don't know how you all felt, but I really felt wounded. I feel that helpless and a little hopeless about the fact that we are willing to have our decision makers put off what could be amazingly important decisions in favor of, or thinking that whatever they say would then go against them. A very negative way of going forward in a very important election.
I agree. Yeah, Marcy.
Was mentioned last night, and I wonder if you would comment now about the tendency from mainstream Judaism in an attempt to gather support for Israel, the embrace of fundamentalist Christian ideology, which basically does not support liberal Jewish values, but is very pro-Israel, and has been very embraced by much of mainstream Judaism because they are so rapidly devoted to Israel. And it's my understanding of their faith, it's not necessarily because they're so in love with the Jews.
Okay, I will answer that question. I know I avoided it last night, and I'm going to avoid it right now. But let me try to. The short answer is, I think part of my goal here today is to try to figure out how we talk in an authentically Jewish voice about the values that we want in terms of a Jewish in terms of a political public square, rather than simply going on the basis of the political expediency of whose ideas are good or self-serving for the same interest that we're trying to promote. The outcome of what I said last night with Micha on the panel is that American Jews, by virtue of the fact that we've arrived, I think very profoundly we've arrived, and I had some disagreements with some folks on the way about the extent to which we've arrived, but from my standpoint, American Jews have arrived, is that there's now finally an opportunity to really articulate very cleanly and very clearly what Jewish values we actually want to see play out in the public square that we now have a share of controlling. Right? Joe Lieberman is case number one of this, who was a truly unabashed Jewish public politician. Like his politics, don't like his politics, like his values, don't like his values. There was no kind of embarrassment of Jewishness. It was actually critical to his whole political career. So you kind of have an opportunity in this moment to say, what Jewish values do we want to have be the ones that define how Jews shape a political sphere, as opposed to what I think is implicit in what a lot of people talk about with the evangelicals is, do their interests overlap with our interests, which is a very different conversation. We'll come back to that, but if there's any other questions on what we've done so far, go ahead, Don.
If I'm following your argument, you're building an image of God, Jewish God, is highly reasonable, and I'll even say highly liberal, has liberal sensibilities. This question, this woman asked, is, to me, really the heart of the matter, that no matter how you today, Yehuda, draw within the Jewish tradition to find a God that's a liberal God. I'll say it between. There is the Southern tradition that you just acknowledged that people who are going to choose a much more fundamentalist God. So the question becomes, if I'm maybe anticipating a little bit where your argument goes, in the end, we can't prevent those Jews who have, say, within our own tradition, who are going to have a view that God is a God of justice. And the reason why all the bad stuff happens in the world is because we did bad things. It's as simple as that. So the question is, aren't we better off keeping both of these images of God out of the focus?
Oh, I didn't realize you were going to go in that direction at the end. Look, the question that I wanted you to ask, which I could answer, I don't know about is that if we know the existence of that view has a legitimate voice within the Jewish tradition, which I think is true, right? What's the point of creating a counter-argument? We'll get to your question in a second. Right. The point of that counter-argument, right, is to say that what I don't want to have happen is that I'm going to say liberal Jews, but with a lowercase l, which includes a lot of conservative Jews with a lowercase c. That for liberal Jews, the argument becomes the choice of liberal values over the religious tradition, right? This is what I'm trying to combat, right? The notion that I have to kind of concede to the tradition, right? The absolute legitimacy of a fundamentalist reading thereof. So I'm trying to retrieve a non-fundamentalist possibility from within the tradition to make vibrant the political discourse. Now, as to your actual question, which is why not leave both of these out, is because I think what that does, and goes to the trivialization of religion problem, is that it forces us to be shells of human beings. If I have to say I check my theology at the door of myself as a political actor, then I've actually left off a major piece of myself in what it means to exercise public leadership and values. I don't want to have to separate between myself as a religious person, as a person of faith, and a person who's promoting values that I think are useful for a political system. What that means is, what I'm saying is, politics is so dirty that values should stay out of it in order to remain pristine. And I think it's hard to do it in America, and it's impossible to do it in the state of Israel. If you're going to build a Jewish state, right, an experiment of Jewish values intersecting with Jewish public leadership, that's why I don't believe in the separation of of Judaism from the state of Israel. I just want it to be a better version of Judaism.
Then you have to acknowledge you're going to have in the public sphere a debate about those different images of God.
Don, if the public political square was actually involved a debate about the images of God from within our tradition, bring it on. That's an interesting public values debate. But instead, we actually don't have that. We have a shadow debate that's one between authentic religious fundamentalism and liberal values. But if you could actually construct a vibrant public debate that said, this is an authentic reading, and it's literally Elu ve'elu. These and these are the words of the living God. If I could construct those and actually place them into the public sphere and imagine that politicians who wrestle with different values approaches to a society are both channeling equally authentic and legitimate images of God, I think that's actually a perfectly legitimate outcome, because it's its own check and balance on fundamentalism. We could come back to it, yeah.
My understanding is that God is capable of intending heavens by his capacity to make the choice. Earlier, if I understood correctly, God only is capable of intervening so much. How was the decision of reason that he didn't intervene in the Holocaust? Is it believed that he made that choice?
I have to not answer that question, because we could do the whole thing here, and I'll answer it with you afterwards, because it was some of the classes, I think, tried to wrestle with this question yesterday, but we'll have to, we'll allude to it at the end when we talk about history a little bit, but I can't go that route. Yes?
So it seems to me there's another level that we haven't talked about that's not theological, but if Jewish political leaders, for example, would say, I'm motivated to support this because I feel an obligation to my tradition to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to take care of the ill. Without talking about the nature of God, let's say, these are the obligations I grew up with, and that's part of my motivation. It's not because I'm a communist, it's because I come from a religious tradition that says we do act in these ways.
Yeah, I don't think that's totally different than what I'm talking about here. I'm trying to add on another layer, right? There's an extent to which you could have a values debate, which has to do with Jewish values as not sourced from a faith tradition. I'm asking, I think, a harder question of what happens when faith becomes a component part of talking about a values tradition. In which case, I want to move beyond just, these are the Jewish values that I hold on to because I'm part of the Jewish people, and actually say, what happens when God does actually enter into the equation? Let me take two more comments, then move on. Yeah.
It seems to me that one of the fundamental problems of any citizens who are trying to keep their political representatives is that what you're trying to do is look at what the person has done in the past and what has driven that person as the best possible indication of how the person is likely to act in the future. I mean, what you have nothing else to go on. And
I think the difference between a fundamentalist incentive of someone who's imposing their will on others is the lack of possibility for change and the lack of possibility for change of circumstance, right? That when the notion of certainty enters into a political discourse, then yes, you can have a democratically elected fundamentalist, as is now the case just south of us, right, in Egypt. You can have a democratically elected fundamentalist, but it creates the conditions for the possibility of a deterioration of a society, right, rather dramatically, and for the risk that, first of all, that the democracy disappears, but second of all, the risk that you've created a false sense of stability on the basis of ideas rather than on realities, right? A non-fundamentalist says, I don't know with total certainty everything about what's going to happen, the world, and my conviction. And so I'm going to govern by the will of the people on the basis of circumstance. And I'm going to choose my values as effectively as I can. A fundamentalist, rather differently, says these are the values, and I'm going to impose these values on a reality even as that reality changes. Let me take one last question, and then, yeah, go ahead, Bobby. Mm-hmm.
know there'll be conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the real issue that's going on, at least in the American political systems, is when Romney will say, or Hartman will say, taxes have to be lower because, or Obama says we have to raise taxes because, and if they believe it's ordained through their faith, you can't compromise. And I think that's what we're really saying.
That's right. That's correct. When you draw a direct line between the problem and the solution, that's the sectarianism that Leo Strauss is talking about, right? It's I move from a big problem to the immediacy of one solution, and I become extremely obstinate about that solution. That produces a fundamentalism even in non-fundamentalist leaders. And it's a problem with the discourse, but it's also a problem with how we understand faith in its intersection with that discourse. So idea number one that we put on the table is how do we change the image of God as being the catalyst to what we hold on to? Second challenge, I think, is how do you change the image of Torah? And the third is how do you change the image of current events? I want to look at one text, a modern text by the theologian David Weiss Halivni. If you've not encountered David Weiss Halivni, the first book you should read by David Weiss Halivni is called The Book and the Sword. It's his own memoir of his survival from Auschwitz. He comes from the same town, I think, as Elie Wiesel. They grew up together. And his journey, he knew Talmud by heart at age 6. He journeyed, after the Shoah, he came to the Jewish Theological Seminary where he was for about 40 years until they began to ordain women. He resigned from the Jewish Theological Seminary, moved to Columbia, and when he retired, he made Aliyah. He has attempted to stay on a line of a kind of progressive orthodoxy for his whole career. And so together with a lot of the theologians who those of you who've been studying great books have been studying, David Weiss Halivni is one of these. But his theology is very much a text-based theology, right? As opposed to a present tense theology, it's an attempt to understand the history of revelation and how that empowers or inhibits us in the present from being contributors to that act of revelation. So Halivni is the promoter of an idea about the continuing unfolding process of Jewish revelation through text. So what we saw from the Talmud was how do you present a different image of God that informs how we relate to God and therefore how we relate to ourselves. Halivni offers us here a different way to view Torah that informs that changes our view of the source of the authority and therefore changes our view of ourselves. Because the second major site of Jewish fundamentalism is through the fundamentalism of Torah. Not just God, but if you believe that the Torah is a divinely authentic document that can't change over time, right, I'm necessarily bound by its provisions to act that way politically, right? That's why you can have a party in Israel in the political system called United Torah Judaism. The source of authority, it doesn't say United God Judaism, it's United Torah Judaism because the source of authority is an unchanging sense of Torah. Never mind, parenthetically, that much of the Torah is not observed. This was the Jacob's book, My Year of Living Biblically, right? If you actually lived by the provisions of the Hebrew Bible, right, you would be you'd be stoning a lot of people a lot of the time. Never mind that I think that there are probably sectors in Jewish life that would like to do that and are merely inhibited by realities from being able to do it, right? But the truth is the Torah is not actually lived out fully. And so what traditional Jews have constructed is a theology of two Torahs, right? A theology of the written Torah and the oral Torah. The oral Torah. Both are inviolable. And the dance about sourcing authority is how do you interface between the written Torah and the oral Torah. And Halivni puts on the table here for us a model, and again, this is me being an activist, a model of how do we understand Torah that frees us to both be active in the world, but not to be fundamentalists. And he says as follows, I'm going to pick up on page 23, 4 lines from the bottom. And I'm going to read this whole thing and then we'll discuss it. Revelation did not change human nature. He's quoting from Maimonides. It merely afforded man an opportunity to change himself. Revelation did not change man into Superman, only into a being capable of infinite improvement, religious and moral. Self-improvement takes a long time to achieve. It took the people more than 700 years to improve themselves sufficiently to embrace monotheism. God, of course, could have instilled a new heart in Israel by a divine means and eradicated the predilection for idolatry in an instant. Yet with such a heart, Israel would no longer have been human. The people might not have allowed revelation to dissipate. They might not have stood idly by as the Torah slipped away through their uncareful fingers. Could God have prevented Israel from making mistakes? Of course. But that would have been the exact diminishment of humanity. Revelation is an opportunity in Halivni's portrayal, drawing on Maimonides, to allow for human self-improvement. Right? It's a destination. It is not it's not something that you acquire. Yet Israel would never have embarked then on the improving journey of the Torah's restoration. In the end, true repentance and self-improvement are more valuable than an artificially installed resolve. Hold on to that line. God does not change the nature of man with whom he was pleased at the time of creation. Israel is forced to find its own way. Though the wounds and scars of the journey remain, the holiness endures as well. Now this is critical. The giving and the receiving of Torah, according to the Bible itself, were not the one and the same event. When God gives Torah, it's not the same as receiving Torah. The revelation of the Torah and its acceptance were separated by ages of negligence and strife. In the desert, despite the people's cry of "we shall do and we shall listen," the appearance of the Torah was followed by idolatry, by apathy, and near-fatal inner strife. When the people of Israel congregated once more, at long last and of their own accord, they found not Moses in the pure, perfect Torah of the wilderness, but Ezra in his composite Torah, made immaculate by centuries of human history. Divine revelation unfolded and completed itself in the time of Ezra, and the written Torah is the result of this unfolding. I'm going to skip to the next page. At Sinai, God provided the flames and thunder of revelation that people were unable to respond. In Ezra's day, the people themselves brought the fire of their zeal to the covenant. Amid these flames of faith, Ezra the scribe assumed the role of prophet and caused a book to emerge anew from the encounter. Ezra himself, as we have seen, saw his Torah as holy and inviolable, and his confidence, along with the new miracle of the people's repentance and attentiveness, allows us to regard our canonical Torah with confidence as the sign of revelation. After a long interval of idolatry and tragedy, which began 40 days after Sinai itself, Israel finally assumed its God-given role and took hold of its Torah. The act of reception itself, together with the prophetic guarantor Ezra, assures us of the Torah's holy status. Moses received the Torah at Sinai. The people of Israel received a canon in Jerusalem. Upon these scriptures, the people set their eyes, as they knew they ought to have done in the wilderness. The people gathered close. They purified themselves in repentance and receptivity. While the people were idol worshippers and syncretists, revelation was not only lost upon them, but incomplete as well. The very essence of the Mosaic covenant is the belief in a unique God, whose will is reflected in the Torah. This belief was absent in the wilderness, but it was present in Ezra's day, and thus the Sinai covenant was finally complete. The covenant to Sinai was realized by means of Ezra's canonical Torah. Thus Ezra's canon received retroactively a Sinaitic imprimatur. The destiny of the nation began in earnest, and our canonical Torah was born, etched in inviolable holiness, not by fire on tablets of stone, but by faith on human hearts. It's an extraordinary text that culminates an extraordinary book called Revelation Restored. Now, Halivni is making a historical textual argument about Sinai, the moment of the first revelation, which, like the creation of humankind, was poorly executed by God. Right? As he says, God created humankind, saw it was very good, and was very proud of God's self. And lo and behold, God created a failure of a human being, right, that never lived up to God's expectation. God tried to destroy that humankind and ultimately realized God was left with this human being. So too, the giving of the Torah. The giving of the Torah was at Sinai, and the Torah should end after the giving of the Torah at Sinai. It's all perfect. They get the book, they go into the land of Israel, and all should play out right. But there's a space that's left open within Jewish tradition for human failure, which in turn makes the process of acquiring Torah a long, long process. What does revelation become in Weiss Halivni's teaching but a process of acquiring core ideas that is never fully complete? Now, Halivni stops the clock a little bit with Ezra, right? Something changes with Ezra. But Halivni, when you open that door, you open up for the possibility of something different, in which the receiving of Torah, the act of revelation, becomes an ongoing learning process. If at any point somebody comes along and says, the revelation is over, we have all of Torah, and it guides our action in the present, the counter-argument is in the Bible itself. The counter-argument is that revelation is not a one-time process that happened once in history, but an ongoing process that is rehabilitated by memory. Right? As we reenact, as we relive, we acquire new pieces of Torah. This is why the rabbis have these famous teachings that a lot of people know in Hebrew school, but is actually very deep, that an infant is taught all of Torah in the womb, right? And then when it's born, what happens? Angel smacks it on its face and it forgets everything, right? And then it's born into the world. And what does that mean? That Torah is not something to be acquired, but something to be reacquired. Right, something to be remembered, that almost in every generation we can undergo a process of new revelation, of acquiring the stuff that didn't happen a long time ago, but is expected to happen once again in our lifetime. That's why we celebrate a cyclical liturgical year. You would think there are people with a long history, once you marked the revelation at Sinai, you would move on to the next thing. But instead, we come to the end of the Torah every year on Simchat Torah. What do? You would think that what should happen next is move into the land of Israel. Finish the story. We end the story every year. It's shocking. Every year it's shocking to me. We get to the end of Deuteronomy. You expect at the end of Deuteronomy, they enter into the land of Israel and the story becomes complete. And then you finish, like you come to the end of the book, and you're like, wait, that's it? And now you start from the beginning, getting the creation of the world, as though our Torah is intending to teach us that Judaism has a basic problem of arrival, an inability to arrive at a destination, and such an emphatic emphasis on the journey that we are trying over and over again to reacquire this revelatory teaching and this revelatory Torah. That we are constantly building on the failures of the past in order to bring about the future. And this reading of Torah and human role in it is so dramatically removed from the notion of fundamentalism. Right? Because I can never stop and say that what I have at my disposal is an actual constitution for the building of a society. All I can say is that I have part of the tools that require me to participate in history to produce the rest of the outcome. So if the first model was, what is the God we worship? The second is, what is the Torah that we study? The God that we worship has to embody humility. The Torah that we study has to embody humanity. Both of these become tools by which we can actually imagine that the politicization of this Torah is dramatically different than a politicization of the Mishnah Berurah. Right? The Mishnah Berurah is a 20th century halachic book which attempts to eliminate any ambiguity of Jewish practice down to and including how you are supposed to tie your shoes in the morning. This Halivni argument is a counter-argument to this and says, lest you believe that we received the revealed Torah once and all we're doing now is commentary, that revelation is etched on human hearts. And when you etch it on human hearts, you open up for the possibility that humans will lead this into directions it's unknown. Yeah, Wes? Why was he so blocked on the women's issue? Look, if you're going to give an opening for somebody to actually bring their humanity into Torah, you have to be willing to acknowledge that that humanity is going to take them in different directions. That's kind of the cost of doing business, right? It means that, and this goes back to ambivalence, it means that you have to let people pick and choose, right? Because he too is human. So what you're saying to him is, why did his humanity, right, demand that he was able to have this theology of an unfolding and not allow this theology of unfolding? And my answer to that is, that's where Jewish theology is interesting, is in the choices that we make rather than the orthodoxy that we demand. Right, this is why the most interesting developments in Judaism are, I think, in North America, are the ones that de-link ideology from practice. I'm a complex Jew. I believe this about that. I believe not this about that. We've argued about this before, but I was involved in starting an independent congregation in the Boston area. And one of the things that we did as part of this independent congregation is that we had separate seating, we were fully egalitarian, and we had no mechitza, no separation. And one of the things, the reason for that was because it had a lot to do with people's upbringing and what they were comfortable with. But what I liked about it pedagogically was that it de-linked unlinked issues. Egalitarianism of the service and separate seating are not the same issue. And the pedagogy of it was, you can't, what denominations require of us is that we subscribe to an orthodox ideology, lowercase o. It's the ideology is fixed by a handful of individuals who determine the ideology for the institution. And what Halivni is opening up, and why I think it's so promising as a political tool, is, one second, de-link it, make it human, right? Be a creator, be a participator in an ongoing process of revelation, rather than the inheritor of a fixed set of boxes. What would an ideology of political participation look like if I wasn't required to subscribe to the tenets of the Democratic Party and the tenets of the Republican Party? And in fact, most Americans identify usually as independent for exactly this reason. It's this humanity. And yet our political system demands that we create orthodoxies on both ends. There's a possibility for a theology of Torah that says to subscribe to Torah is in a deep way to subscribe to pluralism, and the deep way to subscribe to the possibility of a human participation in the ongoing writing of Torah itself. I look at it as a source of authority even as I am changing it. There was another question in the back. Yes?
that they made the decision with and how they justified the responses. That didn't work with his knowledge of and his theology of Torah. And the other thing I'd want to say is, in Breaking of the Tablets, his much later book than Revelation Restored, he walks back from some of the conclusions we read here.
Okay. Last thing I want to do here is if we talked about a changing image of God, a different image of Torah, is I want to talk about a different image of history. Okay, and we'll finish with this. Because the biggest fundamentalist challenge that arises in Israel is actually politically less from the ultra-Orthodox community and more from the religious Zionist community. It's a community to which I have a lot of affinity, but they have constructed a theology, the theology that it's actually uttered in many American synagogues, of the beginning of the flowering of redemption. Avinu Shabashamayim, Tzur Yisrael v'Goalo, Barech et Medina Yisrael, Reshit Smichat Gulatenu. Our God is in heaven. Bless the state of Israel, the beginning of the flowering of our redemption. The comment, the notion of a beginning of a flowering of a redemption is an attempt to understand history in political terms and using a divine mandate. If history is unfolding with a divine mandate, that inclines me to interpret and believe what's happening in history as God speaking to me. And the inevitable instinct of that possibility is the production of religious fundamentalism, right, which is a big feature, which we're not going to talk about today, of one of the ideological challenges that Israel faces with the settler movement. It's not the uniform view of the settler movement, much of which was built out of Israel making available cheap housing for people. That's the majority of the settlement movement was created that way. But a thread out of the Six-Day War was a theology of the belief that the history is unfolding in a particular way, and therefore we need to be subscribing to the ideology of that history. Right? This is one of the most treacherous areas in terms of political theology. One of the examples of this theology is encompassed in Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik's famous essay in 1968, I believe, called Kol Dodi Dofek, who responds to the Kol Dodi Dofek, the voice of my beloved knocketh, comes from the 5th chapter of the Song of Songs. In the 5th chapter of the Song of Songs, I spoke to the Emmanuel folks about this earlier this year. In the 5th chapter of the Song of Songs, the book describes the situation of two lovers who can never find themselves in the same room at the same time. And the beloved knocks on the door. The beloved is in bed and fails to get out of bed. It's a great moment of laziness. I already took off my shoes. How can I put them back on? I took off my cloak. How will I wear it? And by the time the beloved goes to answer the door, the other beloved on the other side is gone. The great missed opportunity to actually find themselves in the same room at the same time. Soloveitchik picks up on this and makes this a metaphor for the history unfolding in the 1967 war, and says God is knocking on our door, and we need to respond politically. Right? This is a signal of God's re-entry and return into history, and I want to name, bechavod, that this is a exciting theology and a highly dangerous theology. Because the minute that you start to interpret world events through the prism of divine history, you get onto the treacherous territory, if you're a believer in God, of having to subscribe to various political outcomes that are necessarily and inevitable as a result of those historical events. So famously, right, I will just look quickly on page 26. First, the knock of opportunity was heard in the political arena. No one can deny that from the standpoint of international relations, the establishment of the State of Israel was in a political sense an almost supernatural occurrence. 2, the knocking of the beloved could be heard on the battlefield. The small Israeli defense forces defeated the mighty armies of the Arab countries. The miracle of the many in the hands of the few took place before our very eyes. 3rd, the beloved began to knock as well at the door of the theological tent, and it may very well be that this is the strongest knock of all. All of the claims of Christian theologians that God deprived the Jewish people of its rights in the land of Israel, and all the biblical promises regarding Zion and Jerusalem refer in an allegorical sense to Christianity and the Christian church, have been publicly refuted by the establishment of the State of Israel and have been exposed as falsehoods lacking all validity. And he goes on. Worth reading. I've excerpted this from a much longer essay. But it goes to the question that was asked earlier about the Holocaust and the instinct to look for God in history in the Holocaust. By virtue of looking for God in history in the good times, puts a challenge on us to have to understand God in the bad times. Right? And it creates, I want to say very explicitly, a dangerous potential for the overinterpretation of God in history to the point that I'm required to make specific political outcomes. If I want to see God in the army, if I want to see God in the state, if I want to see God in conquest, what does that make me do as a result of my belief in that God and interpretation of that history? I'm going to leave for you to read, because we're running out of time, I'm going to leave for you to read one interpretation of this, which comes from David Hartman's recent book, The God Who Hates Lies. But I want to summarize for you David's core idea, which is essential to what I'm talking about today. And it goes back to the ambivalence I mentioned at the beginning. How do we de-link between being interpreters of history, right, receivers of history, and the response that we necessarily produce? He calls the logic of description and the logic of response. Can I describe God in history to the point that it's theologically useful without describing God in history to the point that it demands specific responses? This is the same ambivalence I talked about at the outset. Even if I believe X, does that force my hand to do Y? Can I believe that God is playing a role in history? Can I believe that God enabling the IDF to conquer the West Bank, right, does not incline me to believe that God requires me that I hold on to the West Bank? Can I separate out between the description of God in history and the behaviors that I must necessarily have in history? So the third big idea that I want to put on the table, the first is God and how we understand a God of humility. The second is Torah and how we understand our role in it. And the third is history and the attempt to separate between the two. I want to conclude just by reading to you from two hypermodern texts. One from Yitz Greenberg, which is not in your packet, which I'll just read very briefly, and the other from the poet Yehuda Amichai, both of whom are trying to do exactly this move that David Hartman describes. Yitz Greenberg talks about pluralism as the outcome of the Holocaust. that one of the lessons of the Holocaust is that as the philosophical system of the Nazis, which was predicated on absolute truth, has been shown to demonstrate its absolute consequences. And so every truth in the wake of the Holocaust is a broken truth. Yitz writes as follows in an essential essay called Theology After the Shoah from 2006. Pluralism is the living together of absolute truths, faiths, and systems that have come to know and accept their own limitations, thus making room for the dignity and truth of the other. This broken truth is the future of truth in a broken world. Reb Nachman of Bretzlev once wrote that there is no heart so whole as a broken heart. After the Shoah, the world will come to know there is no truth so whole as a broken truth. And finally, the Amichai poem that I want to read, which is the last piece that we have here, which is consciously and explicitly playing off of the metaphor of the flowering of redemption and coming out with a countercultural reading. He picks up on that very agricultural metaphor to say something very different. And again, I learned this, I mentioned last night, from my teacher, Rabbi Sharon Cohen-Anisfeld. From the place that we are right, from the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard. But doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole or a plow, and a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. Is Amichai diminishing the possibility of revelation and redemption? Absolutely not. What Amichai is laying on the table is that a vision for redemption is one that is plowed through ambivalence, right? Ambivalence and doubt that actually winds up flowering the world. So I want to put on the table as an advocate, right, that how we understand God, how we talk about Torah, and how we talk about history all can be done in a framework that enables us to actually bring about a positive culture rather than a fundamentalist culture, and I would suggest is equally rich and not trivial even when it's ported onto a political identity. Thank you.